This is John Musgrave. Thank you for coming to the podcast. If you like this content or this episode, please click like or even subscribe or hit that thumbs up button on your screen, and that'll help more people find us. Thanks for listening. Pre-quiz here. Number one. Faith, would you read our number one and all our choices for us?
When was the exile? A. 930 to 722 BC. B. 1050 to 930 BC. C. 538 to 515 BC. D. 605 to 539 BC.
And our answer is D, yeah, 605 to 539 BC. Now, all the other date periods are significant. So let's go in the bonus round here. A, 930 to 722. What's that period? Yeah, that's the divided kingdom. That's when northern Israel exists as a separate thing from Judah. The kingdom splits in 930, and then the north is scattered by Assyria in 722. So that's the period where you have both Israel and Judah as separate kingdoms, 930 to 722. How about B, 1050 to 930?
Saul to David to Solomon.
Yeah, the United Kingdom. So you got Saul, David, and Solomon, each occupying 40 years of time, from 1050 to 930. So that's the United Kingdom, 3 United Kings there. How about C, 538 to 515 BC?
The exile to the completion of the rebuilding of the temple.
Yeah, return. So 538 is when they arrive back in Jerusalem from Babylon. And 515 is when they complete the temple. So those are the years where the temple's not yet, they're back in the land, but the temple's not yet reconstructed. 538 to 515. Okay. Very good. Okay, and then D, who's exiled in 605? Daniel and his friends, and then folks got the decree of what king and what nation decrees the return from exile? Cyrus, yeah. And what's his other name? Darius, yeah, Darius the Mede. So it's Darius from Daniel 6, Daniel in the Lion's Den. Cyrus, when you're looking at Ezra and Isaiah. So two names. One, it may be two different languages, or it may be one's a throne name, and one's the name he grew up with. Okay, number two, Joyce.
Ezekiel ministered in exile. True or false?
That, true, he did. So Ezekiel is off. He's been carried off in the 597 exile. Okay. He was in the main deportation, Ezekiel was. And so he ministers from his exiled position in Babylon. Okay, number three, Matthew.
Ezekiel was ministering before the destruction of the temple. True or false?
True. Yeah. Ezekiel talks about a final destruction for Jerusalem and the temple that's yet to happen. Okay, so part of Ezekiel's ministering, part of his ministering is before, in that period between the 597, 598, 597 and 586. So during that period where Zedekiah is still reigning in Judah, in Judea, but the temple destruction and the destruction of Jerusalem has not occurred yet. Okay, you haven't had any of this yet, so this is just getting your mind flowing here. Number four, Manny.
Ezekiel preached much, but his preaching contained only a few visions. True or false?
False. Ezekiel's especially known for his visions. He's one of the prophets. He's not the top, but very much. And so you see that picture there. He's Ezekiel is them bones, them dry bones. you know, and then the wheels in the air, not the Journey song. But Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air. That's Ezekiel 2, so you can see that in there. But Ezekiel certainly has lots of visions. That's a big part of the book of Ezekiel. Okay, number 5, Josiah, would you read that for us?
So Ezekiel saw the Lord's Spirit leave the temple in a vision, true or false?
That's pretty bad.
It's true. So Ezekiel has a vision, and the Spirit of God gets up out of the Holy of Holies and leaves the temple and heads east. All right, Andrew, would you read the next one for us? So that would be 6, and just read the setup for us. Just 6.
Ezekiel was given instructions for
Okay, and Pat, would you read A for us?
A new palace for the post-exilic son of David, king.
Bill, B.
The rebuilding of the Jerusalem walls.
Matt, C.
How the Israelites could serve the king in Babylon.
Okay, and Teresa, D.
a new temple.
Okay, only one of these is true. So Ezekiel's given instructions for one of these. What one do you think it is? D. Yeah, new temple. And it's slightly different than what was given to Solomon. And just side point, it never gets built that way. When they do return from exile, they don't put it together that way. 7, Stephen.
Ezekiel preached about judgment that was coming to all the nations, true or false?
It's true, yeah. Talked about this, the judgment that God was spilling out on all these nations through Babylon. And then 8, Andrew.
Ezekiel received instructions from God to reset the tribal boundaries of the promised land upon the return from exile. True or false?
It's true. It's false.
It's not what, here's the hint, it's not what you would expect.
True then.
True. It's true. The tribal boundaries are reset for the return. Again, IHCs. But it ends up, if you can see this, I'll show the camera here. I drew a map of it once. But it ends up being this. It's just equal land to each tribe, horizontally spread. You can see that. There we go. Yeah, Bill.
So when you say reset, do you mean changed from before? Or
Yes.
Same as before?
Changed from before.
Changed.
Yeah. Reset from what Joshua had determined. Yeah, that's what I mean by that word. Good question. Yep. Laura.
Was that done that way?
It wasn't. Yeah, so most of the stuff we read from, so just general thing to understand the prophets, most of the stuff we read about the restoration from the pre-exilic and the exilic prophets, the prophets before the exile and the prophets during the exile, the exilic prophets, doesn't come out that way. And why not? Why are we comfortable with that? Yeah, intervening historical contingencies. And so God's people are unfaithful when they return. And so all these things that could have been, which were glorious, don't happen. Yeah. Okay. So that's our setup for Ezekiel there. Let's go forward. Our author of Ezekiel, Betsy.
Ezekiel was a Zadokite priest who was exiled with King Jehoiachin and the nobles of Jerusalem, among others, in 597. What is that, 6?
Or 596,
Okay.
right around there.
He was called to be a prophet to the exiles in 593 while living among them when he was 30 years old.
Okay. So the book starts out like that, and he talks about being 30. He dates, where he gets his call there, and so it looks like 593 there. He was exiled in that main deportation. So he's off in Babylon, scattered with God's people over there, and ministers to him. He's a priest. Jeremiah was a priest also, but also a prophet. So here's an example of Old Testament where you have one person occupying two of the three offices. Okay, and so that's not completely unusual. Who else was a two office holder? Can we think of some in the Old Testament? So our offices are what? What are our three offices? Yeah, so our offices there are prophet, priest,
King.
and king. Yeah, and so Ezekiel is in two of these. Which two is he in? Prophet and priest. And so Ezekiel's here. Yep. Who else is a double office holder?
Melchizedek.
Yeah, Melchizedek is a double office holder. And which is he?
King and priest.
King and priest. And so Hebrews 7 talks a lot about this, but he's in Genesis and Hebrews as well. Hebrews 7 there. I think it's Genesis 13. Anyone know Melchizedek? I think it's Genesis 13. But he is a king who's a priest. Okay, anyone else? Okay, Samuel is what two would we put Samuel in? Yeah. Prophet and priest. He ordains kings, but he's not a king. Yeah.
Aaron? Prophet, priest, or not?
Maybe we could put him as a prophet as he spoke to Pharaoh, but he doesn't really do a lot of speaking to God's people. So probably he's a priest, but maybe a little bit prophet there. I'm not sure if either of those guys, I don't think they were priests. Yeah, Bill.
King David.
King David, yeah, which is David?
He's a prophet.
King is prophet.
King and prophet, yeah, king and prophet. And so, now why do we say David is a prophet?
Because it in Psalms.
Yeah, he wrote scripture. That's prophetic. Okay, anyone who's writing scripture is a prophet. He's teaching the things of God. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Would Moses qualify as a prophet? No, never mind. Well, wait, he was in charge though, right? So.
Yeah, he kind of holds a kingly office, kind of like Joshua, but he's not officially a king, but he is in that functionally he's the guy God has put in place to lead the people. Yeah, Manny.
Two questions, unrelated, but Elijah made that sacrifice, right, with the Baal situation.
Yeah.
Does that make him a priest? Second question, do all of these offices, kind of like maybe like our government, right, these three offices, do they always exist or need to exist, should exist?
In the Old Testament, they don't always all three exist at the same time. Really, the prophetic office, a lot of that, the prophets come up when God's people are what? In disobedience and wickedness. If God's people are just tracking along, and that was the king's job, so there was a tiny bit of prophetic in the king. The king was to, Deuteronomy 17, the king was to have his own copy of what? The law, and read it all the days of his life. And the king was in charge of keeping the people faithful, okay? Keeping the priests faithful, knowing what needed to go on in the temple so that he could see that the priests were being faithful and the Levites were being faithful. So prophets are really on an as needed basis there. Priests were always to be there, and kings were always to be there. But during the exile, there's no king. There are priests who are not functioning. And so really the only functioning office during the exile are the prophets. Yeah, a good question there. And Elijah making that sacrifice, I don't know. We don't have anything definitive there. Certainly the Lord told him to do that. Yeah. Okay. Good. So author is Ezekiel. He's a prophet. He's exilic. He's been carried off into exile, writing from Babylon. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at his ministry there. And so here's Judah, where it came from. That's the Mediterranean Sea there. And so let's read this, and we're over to Mallory.
Ezekiel ministered from 593 BC 1-2 to at least 571 BC 29-17.
Okay, so there are dates of his ministry. The first thing he records happens in 593 when he's called to be a prophet to God's people. And the last thing we see historically is around 571. We see that in 29:17. And then Jim, next bullet for us.
He ministered all while in exile to the exiles.
Okay. So his ministry was he doesn't start ministering until he's exiled anyway. So he's completely, thank you, he's completely in exile, ministering to exiles, preaching to exiles, writing his book to exiles there. And so here's a little map there. You've got the Tigris, the main two rivers you hear about. You even see these coming out of the Garden of Eden. The Tigris and Euphrates are two of the four rivers. We don't know about the other two, but Tigris there, the Euphrates there. If you ever see in Scripture the river, it's the Euphrates. See that even in Revelation, the riverbed is dried out, but the Euphrates River there. And so Ezekiel's near Nippur, there that is. He writes about being by the Kabar River Valley, which is a canal stemming from the Euphrates River, which is this thing here. Here's the Persian Gulf. So if you were around in the early 90s, this is where all that the Persian Gulf War was going on, right down here with Iraq, down here in Babylon and Kuwait there. Okay. All right, so that's his ministry. Now talk about his book, right? We make this distinction between the ministry and the book. So what's going on with the book? Charlene.
The last recorded historical event in the book, A Word from the Lord, was in 571 BC, chapter 29:17.
Okay, so the assembly of the book, Ezekiel's getting the book down, happens after all the history, right? He's writing about stuff in past tense, so it's stuff that already happened. And so we're always doing this with a book, to date a book. When was this written? We look at the last event recorded and we say, okay, that's the earliest possible date for the writing of this book. Bob.
There is not mention of sight.
Whoops, that should be of.
There is not mention of Cyrus' edict of 538 BC.
Yeah. So no mention of the Cyrus edict of 538 BC. So presumably that would be mentioned if the book were written after that. So we say a late date for Ezekiel would be 530 or 540, right, before the edict, because Ezekiel shows no knowledge of it, didn't write of it, and an early date would be 571. So there's our range for the writing of this book. All right, Jim, next.
Since the book was written during the exile between 571 and 538 BC.
Yeah. Christina.
For memory's sake, say 560.
Okay, so we don't know, so just say Ezekiel 560. Okay, kind of middle of the exile there. It's after 571. If you want to say 570, go for it. But it's probably not too important where in that range that you land for this. Okay, key events for the days of the writing prophets. So don't stress out about this being small, but you can just see there's our kingdom division 931, 930. Here's some return stuff and Nehemiah last reforms in 432. But here we go for Ezekiel's ministry is occurring right during here. So it just kind of during this exile period, and his ministry ends at 571. That's the last thing he records. But then his book's going to be after the last thing he records. And so here's our book thing. Boy, that didn't turn out too well. It looks a lot better on a computer screen. And so the book we're looking right there. See, that showed up. That's in black. But the book is right about there. And there we go. And that still didn't show up very well. You can, if you're really close, you can see. There you go. So, boy, glad I spent 10 minutes making that bigger. That really helped. Okay, outline for Ezekiel. It's a big book, really big book, but a simple outline. It's kind of like Isaiah. You got three outline points in this book. And so 1:1, Dakota.
Judgment and destruction against Jerusalem.
Okay, so first part of the book is about this judgment and destruction that's going to happen to Jerusalem. So this tells us this is stuff from when Ezekiel is preaching. Now, where is he preaching from again? Exile, Babylon. But he's preaching about a destruction that's going to happen to Jerusalem. So we know that this preaching is occurring before what year?
586.
586. Yeah, so the so this front section of the book is sermon highlights from his preaching during the 590s. Okay, so 586 is our temple and Jerusalem destruction, and the front part of the book is about this is going to happen. So Ezekiel's writing, or he's preaching out in front of here, and he records these things in the front part of the book. We'll talk about some time things after we get through the rest of the outline here. So chapter 25 is Anna.
Judgment against the nation.
Okay, so Ezekiel, easy. Okay, first two sections, judgment. And where does judgment begin? With the house of God, right? So God judges his own people first. Okay, and that's true in Ezekiel also. Okay, so Ezekiel, think about, easy, 1 and 25. Okay, got a cent and got a quarter. So 1 and 25, those are the first two sections of Ezekiel. And the first is judgment on Jerusalem and the temple destruction, all that kind of stuff that's going to happen. And then the second thing, he talks about judgment that's coming against the nations. Babylon's doing all of this. And God is using Babylon. Remember that conversation back and forth between God and what prophet? Back and forth? Habakkuk. Back and forth. Habakkuk and forth. Okay? About God using Babylon as his instrument of judgment on the nations and discipline on his people. Okay, and Habakkuk says, how can you do this? They're more wicked than we are. And God says, noted, but you're more responsible to obey me than they are. and I'm a loving father, and I will discipline you, and I will be faithful to the covenant, even the covenant curses, and I'll use Babylon to do it. And so that's the first. Those are the first two sections of Ezekiel: judgment against and destruction against Jerusalem, and then judgment against the nations. And so from 25 forward, you've got all these. And if you're looking like through your Bibles, you see judgment against this nation, judgment against that nation, and all these oracles or prophecies or sermons that Ezekiel in exile is preaching to the people in exile, to his own people, saying, this nation's going to get judged, and this nation is going to get judged. He's not traveling around to these nations and proclaiming to them judgment that's coming. Go ahead and open to Ezekiel if you haven't already. Ezekiel is a really big book, and so it's one of what we call what kind of prophet? He's a major prophet, and rightly named because he is major. It is a big book. But if you look, go to chapter 25. I mean, you can look. Just go back to 21, just to get the feel of this first section as well. Look above chapter 21. What's our NIV title for chapter 21?
Babylon, God's sword of judgment.
Yeah, Babylon, God's sword of judgment. And who is he judging? Look at the top of 22. Jerusalem. So he recounts Jerusalem's sins and why God is using Babylon to judge them. And then at the end of 24, he tells about Jerusalem's destruction and gives them a date. And Ezekiel's wife dies, and he's told not to mourn. And that's symbolic over, don't mourn over Jerusalem. They deserved it.
That his wife deserves it then, or?
No, that's not the implication. But it's God. Jerusalem was God's bride. And God himself was not mourning over his own bride. And so Ezekiel's told to do what the prophets are often told to do, a symbolic action that illustrates. It's an illustration. So like Hosea, symbolic action, marry a prostitute. Because God says, that's what I've done, and you guys are the prostitutes. But 25 there begins our second section. So you can see as you go down there, just look at the titles: prophecy against Ammon, prophecy against Moab, prophecy against Edom, prophecy against Philistia, prophecy against Tyre, and then a big long section about Tyre. See, that keeps going and going. And then you get to 29, prophecy against Egypt. Okay, and then 30 is even a lament for Egypt. 32, a lament for Pharaoh. Okay, and then that in 32 ends our second section. And then we get to chapter 33. And let's see, Lily, would you read outline point chapter 33 for us?
Chapter 33, verse 1, restoration, promises, and reconstruction, instructions for Judah.
Okay. Richard Pratt on his outline just has restoration and reconstruction for Judah, but I put those parentheses in because it just helps me out a little bit. And but the end of the book, 33 onward, is talking about restoration promises, things God is saying that he's going to do for his people, and also instructions for the people for the time when they go back, what are they to do? And so we've talked in the pre-quiz about two sets of instructions that God gave to his people for when they returned. You remember that from our pre-quiz? Instructions for, name one of them. Temple rebuilding. Yeah, how are you to rebuild the temple? What's it to be like? And it has differences from the Solomonic temple. Not major things, it's just like this is bigger and this has more of that. It's a grander temple than Solomon built, but the same furniture and structures are there. what are the other instructions besides temple that Ezekiel gets?
Allocation of land.
Yeah, the distribution of the land is different. It's horizontal boundaries from north to south, and it's got a central section for the king and the Levites, okay, so those are 3 sections: 1, 25, 33. Destruction for Jerusalem, and then destruction for what's 25 onward? The nations. And then 33 is looking back to the promised land, and so that's what? Yeah, all the reconstruction stuff. Restoration and reconstruction for Judah. Okay, and so that's Ezekiel. That's the book. He's writing from exile before the temple's destroyed. And so he first talks about Jerusalem's really going to get it. And then he talks about, but so are the other nations. That's the second section. And then the third section is, here are some instructions for when you get back. See how prophets aren't that hard? Okay, if you root them in the historical context, you say, okay, I know what he's talking about. And these, the reason we do the outline is so you know what he's talking about when he's talking about it. What's he talking about here and when? And we root that in when the prophet lived, and therefore who was he preaching to? Who are these words given to, and who did he write them down for? And so he's writing them down for exiles, and he's giving them exactly what they need. There's more coming to Jerusalem. Be glad that you're not back there, because they're going to get it bad. Okay, he's writing to exiles. They were not going to experience the destruction of Jerusalem because they were already in exile. And then God's fairness and judging other nations as well through Babylon, and then instructions for getting back. Okay, Ezekiel's our main big exilic prophet. There aren't many exilic prophets. Jeremiah kind of has a little bit of exilic, but he's mostly ministering in the promised land. Who's another very famous prophet with a book that's in exile? Daniel. Yeah, Daniel. Okay. All right. The purpose of the book. Let's see. Ashley, you get the big one here.
Ezekiel wrote his book to the exiles to remind them that his judgment prophecies concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, chapters 1 through 24, and the nations, chapters 25 to 32, were taking place. Therefore, they should believe his restoration prophecies will also take place, and follow the plan he revealed for a priest-led reconstruction of Jerusalem, chapters 33 through 43.
Okay. So you get the flow of this. We'll look at this for a little bit. So he's writing the book, remember, after all this judgment has happened, especially after the judgment of Jerusalem has happened. So why is he writing that if it's already happened? He's including all these sermons that he wrote. This is going to happen to Jerusalem. But he's writing it down and publishing it after it's already happened. And so you see there, and this is a frequent dynamic in Scripture with a book, that the prophet is saying, I told you this would happen, and now you know this happened, right? And I told you that. And a lot of times it's, and nobody believed me. and it was improbable, but it's happened. The word of the Lord is true. Listen to his prophets. If they tell you something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And if he tells you something's going to happen and you don't want it to happen, be faithful. And then maybe it won't happen because of IHCs. But Ezekiel writes this book to remind them that his judgment prophecies had come true. All these nations had been judged by Babylon. It experienced the warfare by Babylon, and they had been crushed. Jerusalem had been defeated. The temple had been burnt down. And so, what's left? What's in the future in Ezekiel's book? Restoration. And so this gives them confidence that he's written the first 2/3 of the book. It gives them confidence that God could do what he had declared he wanted to do in the promised land when they returned from exile. First of all, that they would return, that there would be a son of David who would reign again, that there would be inheritance of the land again, that the temple would be reconstructed. And so they shouldn't say, oh, that'll never happen. Because what he proclaimed in advance about Jerusalem and about the nations had occurred. So his word was faithful because it was coming from the Lord. So he's proving my words are from the Lord, so you should listen. So when you get back from, one, have hope that we'll be restored. And two, when you get restored, follow these words. Does that make sense? How the book is working? And that's a common thing in the prophets, where the book is written after what was preached before an event has happened. And so then the book gets written and it says, I preached this and it happened, therefore listen to this, which is in your present and in your future of what you can do and be a part of. Okay. Does that make sense how that works? Okay.